The awakening. The galaxy had known peace for 3 centuries, a peace carefully maintained by the Galactic Union and its countless member species. Among them, the Terran Federation stood out not for their military might or territorial ambitions, but for their relentless pursuit of harmony. Humans had joined the Union 200 years ago, and in all that time they had never once fired a weapon in anger. They were traders, scientists, and diplomats. They built hospitals on struggling worlds and shared their agricultural technology freely. They mediated disputes and offered refuge to those fleeing persecution. The galaxy had come to see them as gentle, perhaps even naive. It was a reputation humanity had carefully cultivated, and one they had grown comfortable with. Commander Ilara Voss stood on the observation deck of the civilian transport ship Horizon's Edge, watching the blue-green planet of Sanctuary Prime rotate peacefully below. The colony was home to 2 million souls, mostly families who had left the crowded cities of Earth to build something new. Farms stretched across fertile valleys and small towns dotted the coastlines. Children played in parks while their parents worked in research facilities, studying the unique ecosystem that made Sanctuary Prime so valuable. It was a world without weapons, without military installations, without fear. Ilara herself had grown up here, running through wheat fields and swimming in crystal-clear lakes. She had left to join the diplomatic corps 15 years ago, but she still called this place home. The peaceful moment shattered when alarms screamed across every channel. Ilara's communicator exploded with panicked voices as massive ships tore through the upper atmosphere. The vessels were unlike anything in Union registry, angular and brutal in their design, covered in weapon arrays that glowed with malevolent energy. They belonged to the Vraxian Empire, a species that had emerged from beyond the galactic rim just 5 years ago. The Vraxians were conquerors by nature, tall reptilian beings who measured worth only in strength and territory. They had ignored every diplomatic overture, every peace offering, every attempt at dialogue. The Union had decided to leave them alone, hoping they would eventually see reason. That hope died as the first orbital bombardment began. Ilara watched in horror as beams of superheated plasma lanced down from the Vraxian fleet, striking population centers with calculated precision. The city of New Haven, where 500,000 people lived and worked, vanished in a flash of white light. The agricultural zones burned next, then the research stations, then the spaceports. There was no warning, no demands, no chance for surrender or evacuation. The Vraxians simply erased everything humans had built on Sanctuary Prime in less than 30 minutes. Ilara's hands gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white as she tried to process what she was seeing. The transport ship's captain was already plotting an emergency jump to the nearest Union station, but Ilara couldn't look away from the dying world below. 2 million people gone. Just gone. Families she had known since childhood, friends she had made over the years, the teacher who had encouraged her love of xenobiology, the farmer who had taught her to appreciate the simple beauty of growing things, all of them reduced to ash and memory in minutes. The Vraxian fleet commander broadcast a message on all frequencies, his voice dripping with contempt. He declared that Sanctuary Prime now belonged to the Vraxian Empire, and that any human presence in this sector would be met with the same fate. He called humanity weak, pathetic, and unworthy of the resources they possessed. He said the galaxy would be better once the Vraxians had cleansed it of such inferior species. The Galactic Union convened an emergency session within hours. Representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered in the Great Assembly Hall on Union Prime, their faces reflecting shock, horror, and uncertainty. The Vraxians had committed an act of unprecedented aggression, violating every law and treaty that held civilized space together. But what could be done? The Vraxian military was vast and powerful, their technology advanced, their willingness to use overwhelming force proven. Economic sanctions meant nothing to a species that took what it wanted by force. Military intervention would mean war on a scale the Union had never seen, and no one was eager to sacrifice their own people to avenge humanity. The human delegation's seats remained empty. Ambassador Chen, who had served the Union faithfully for 40 years, did not appear. Neither did any other human representative. The Union's attempts to contact Earth went unanswered. Every human embassy, every diplomatic mission, every trade station operated by the Terran Federation went dark simultaneously. Ships carrying human diplomats simply turned around mid-journey and headed back to Sol system without explanation. The silence was deafening and deeply unsettling. The other species began to whisper among themselves, wondering if humanity had already surrendered, if they were preparing to abandon their colonies and retreat to Earth. The Vraxian delegation sat in the gallery, openly mocking the absent humans. Emperor Kraxith himself had deigned to attend, a massive specimen even among his kind, his scales black as void and eyes like burning coals. He addressed the assembly with barely concealed amusement, explaining that the Vraxians had given humanity a gift by attacking first. Now the weak species could flee without the burden of pretending to be relevant. He announced that 7 more human colonies lay within Vraxian expansion corridors, and they would all be claimed within the month. If humans wanted to avoid further losses, they should evacuate immediately. The Emperor seemed to expect applause, or at least acknowledgement of his generosity in offering this warning. What he got instead was silence, but not the kind he expected. Ambassador Threll of the Corvani Collective, an ancient species with long memories, rose slowly from his seat. His people had been part of the Union since its founding, and their archives contained information most others had forgotten or never known. Threll's voice trembled slightly as he requested an emergency private session with the Union Council. He looked genuinely frightened, which was remarkable considering the Corvani had faced down extinction events and survived wars that had consumed entire sectors. The council granted his request, and behind closed doors, Threll shared what his people had discovered about humanity. The truth was buried in classified files from humanity's first contact with the Union 2 centuries ago. The initial survey teams had been thorough, cataloging human history, culture, and development before allowing them to join galactic society. What they found had terrified them. Humanity's rise from primitive tribes to spacefaring civilization was drenched in blood. They had fought each other constantly, developing increasingly horrific weapons with each generation. Chemical warfare that melted flesh from bone. Biological weapons that turned bodies against themselves. Nuclear weapons that could end civilizations in hours. And they had used all of it, repeatedly, without hesitation. The survey teams had documented thousands of wars, some lasting decades, killing millions. They read accounts of battles where humans had fought to the last soldier rather than surrender, of sieges where entire populations chose starvation over defeat, of tactics so brutal they defied comprehension. Humans had developed something called mutually assured destruction, building enough weapons to exterminate themselves dozens of times over, then pointing them at each other for generations. They had come within moments of total self-annihilation multiple times, saved only by luck or the conscience of individuals willing to disobey orders. But then something remarkable happened. Humanity looked at what they had become and chose to change. They unified their fractured nations, dismantled their weapons of mass destruction, and redirected their energy toward peace. They spent a century healing their world and themselves before reaching for the stars. When they finally made contact with the Union, they presented themselves as the species they had chosen to become, not the species they had been. The survey teams, seeing the genuine transformation, had made a decision. They buried the full military history deep in classified archives and allowed humanity to join the Union with their reputation intact. It seemed cruel to judge them for a past they had overcome, but Threll understood what the Vraxians did not. Humanity had not forgotten how to wage war. They had simply chosen not to. There was a profound difference between a species that could not fight and one that would not. The Vraxians had just reminded humanity why they had once been so terrifyingly good at violence. As Threll finished his briefing, the council members sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the true nature of humanity's silence. They were not surrendering. They were deciding. On Earth, in a bunker deep beneath the Appalachian Mountains, Fleet Admiral James Kane stood before a wall of holographic displays showing every corner of human space. He was 70 years old, with gray hair and a face lined by years of service, but his eyes burned with fierce intelligence. He had spent his entire career preparing for a war he prayed would never come, training fleets that would hopefully never see combat, and developing strategies he hoped would remain theoretical. That prayer had just been answered with fire and death. Around him, the command staff worked in focused silence, coordinating the largest military mobilization in human history. The orders went out on encrypted channels that had not been used in 200 years. Every human colony, every station, every outpost received the same message. Code Crimson. It was the phrase humanity had hoped never to hear again, but every citizen knew what it meant. The reserves were activated immediately. Millions of humans who had lived peaceful lives as farmers, teachers, engineers, and artists reported to hidden armories and training facilities. They put on uniforms they had kept in storage, checked weapons they had hoped never to fire, and prepared to become soldiers once more. The transformation was eerily smooth, like a machine switching on after a long dormancy. Hidden bases throughout human space came alive. What the galaxy had assumed were mining stations and research outposts revealed their true nature as massive shipyards and military complexes. Humans had not built weapons for 2 centuries, but they had maintained the knowledge and infrastructure to do so if necessary. Now in dozens of star systems, factories that had produced peaceful goods retooled overnight to manufacture instruments of war. The technology was new, but the principles were ancient and well understood. Humanity had not forgotten the lessons written in blood across their history. Admiral Caney reviewed the fleet composition reports with grim satisfaction. The Terran Defense Force consisted of 3,000 warships that officially did not exist, crewed by personnel who were supposedly civilians, armed with weapons the Union had never seen. Every ship was named after a place or person from Earth's violent past, a reminder of the cost of war and the reasons humanity had chosen peace. The TDF Verdun, the TDF Hiroshima, the TDF Stalingrad, each name carrying the weight of millions of dead and the promise that such losses would be avenged. The ships were designed with human military philosophy in mind, emphasizing speed, stealth, and overwhelming firepower. They did not look like the elegant vessels favored by other species, instead appearing angular and aggressive, built for function rather than form. Their weapon systems incorporated technology humanity had developed but never deployed, ranging from advanced kinetic weapons to electromagnetic pulse bombs to psychological warfare tools that could break an enemy's will without firing a shot. Every system had been tested in simulation millions of times, refined and perfected by strategists who studied warfare the way others studied art. Caney pulled up the tactical assessment of Vraxian forces. They were powerful, no question, with superior numbers and centuries of combat experience, but they fought in predictable patterns relying on overwhelming force and intimidation. They had never faced an opponent that understood warfare as deeply as humanity did, that had studied every aspect of conflict and learned from thousands of years of making mistakes. The Vraxians thought strength meant size and firepower. Humans knew it meant adaptability, creativity, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect their own. The Admiral opened a channel to all TDF vessels. His message was brief and clear. The Vraxians had murdered 2 million civilians without provocation or warning. They had declared their intention to continue killing humans until none remained in their path. Humanity's response would be measured but absolute. Every Vraxian military asset would be neutralized. Every ship, every base, every weapon that threatened human life would be destroyed. But civilians would be spared whenever possible. Humanity would not become the monsters they once were, even in the face of monstrous actions. They would show the Vraxians and the galaxy that strength and mercy were not mutually exclusive. As the TDF prepared to move, the galaxy held its breath. The Vraxians continued their advance, confident in their superiority. 7 human colonies lay in their path, representing millions more lives. Emperor Kraxith had already dispatched his fleets, expecting easy victories and quick territorial gains. He had no idea that humanity's silence was not submission but preparation. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, the galaxy would learn the truth about the species they thought they knew. Humanity was peaceful by choice, not necessity, and when that choice was taken away, the result would be terrifying. The reckoning. The Vraxian armada moved through space like a plague of locusts. 3 separate battle groups, each consisting of 500 warships heading toward human colonies, designated for annexation. Grand Admiral Vokrath commanded the central fleet from his flagship Dominator's Fang, a massive dreadnought that had broken the defenses of 40 worlds. He sat in his command throne, claws tapping against the armrest as he reviewed the pathetic resistance he expected from humanity. Intelligence reports showed no military presence at any of the target colonies, no orbital defenses, no patrol craft. The humans had apparently learned nothing from the destruction of Sanctuary Prime. They still believed their weakness would somehow save them. Vokrath had fought for 60 years across a dozen wars of conquest. He had seen species beg for mercy, others fight hopelessly to the last soldier, and some attempt clever traps that ultimately failed against Vraxian might. Humans would likely evacuate and run, which was fine. The Emperor wanted territory, not necessarily genocide. If the humans fled quickly enough, Vraxian forces could occupy the colonies intact and put them to proper use. Still, Vokrath felt a twinge of disappointment. He had hoped for at least token resistance, something to make this campaign memorable. Instead, it would be another boring expansion mission against a species too cowardly to defend itself. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 hours before the fleet reached the colony of New Harmony. Long-range sensors detected unusual energy signatures at the edge of the system, but they vanished before proper analysis could be completed. Vokrath ordered increased scanning, but the sensors found nothing. His tactical officer suggested it might have been quantum drive residue from fleeing civilian ships, which seemed reasonable. Humans were probably evacuating as quickly as possible, smart enough at least to recognize when they were beaten. The fleet continued its approach, weapons powered and ready for the trivial task of occupying an undefended world. They never reached New Harmony. When the fleet was still 2 light hours out, space itself seemed to tear open. Quantum portals, hundreds of them, materialized in perfect geometric patterns surrounding the Vraxian formation. From each portal emerged a human warship, appearing with surgical precision at optimal firing positions. The Terran Defense Force had arrived, and they brought 3,000 reasons for the Vraxians to regret their aggression. Vokrath had perhaps 5 seconds to register shock before the humans opened fire, and in those 5 seconds, he understood that everything he thought he knew about humanity was catastrophically wrong. The human attack was unlike anything in Vraxian experience. There were no demands for surrender, no posturing broadcasts, no theatrical displays of power. The TDF ships simply began systematically destroying their targets with clinical efficiency. Kinetic rounds traveling at relativistic speeds punched through Vraxian shields as if they did not exist, turning mighty warships into expanding clouds of debris. Electromagnetic pulse weapons shut down entire squadrons simultaneously, leaving them floating helpless in the void. Missile swarms so dense they appeared as solid walls of light overwhelmed point defense systems and found their marks with perfect accuracy. But the physical destruction was only part of humanity's assault. The Vraxians discovered too late that humans understood psychological warfare better than any species in the galaxy. Every Vraxian ship suddenly received broadcasts on their internal communication systems, bypassing all security protocols. The messages showed detailed schematics of Vraxian vessels with critical systems highlighted, along with precise countdowns to when those systems would be destroyed. The countdowns were accurate to the millisecond. Vraxian crews watched in horror as human weapons struck exactly where and when the broadcasts predicted, creating a paralyzing sense of helplessness. Admiral Caney watched the battle unfold from the bridge of his flagship Remembrance, named for all the humans who had died in wars past. His tactical display showed the Vraxian fleet fragmenting as captains made independent decisions to flee, fight, or desperately maneuver. It was exactly what human strategists had predicted. The Vraxians were used to facing opponents who panicked when confronted with superior force. They had no experience being on the receiving end of such treatment, and their command structure was not designed to handle it. Caney allowed himself no satisfaction in their confusion. This was not sport or revenge. It was a necessary demonstration. The human fleet divided into smaller task forces, each pursuing fleeing Vraxian ships with relentless precision. The TDF vessels were faster, more maneuverable, and equipped with sensor technology that made hiding impossible. Vraxian crews who tried to escape found human ships waiting at every possible jump point. Those who attempted to fight discovered that human point defense could intercept 98% of incoming fire, while human weapons had no such difficulty finding their targets. Within 3 hours, Vokrath's fleet of 500 warships had been reduced to 73 disabled hulks drifting in space. The rest were debris. Vokrath himself survived only because Caney ordered his ship disabled rather than destroyed. The Dominator's Fang hung powerless in space, its weapons offline, its engines dead, its crew trapped inside a tomb of their own making. A single human corvette, a ship 1/10 the dreadnought size, held position nearby. The corvette's captain sent a message to Vokrath, and the tone was not triumphant or angry. It was educational. The captain explained calmly that humanity had recorded every tactical maneuver, every weapon deployment, every command decision the Vraxians had made. This data would be analyzed and used to make human forces even more effective against Vraxian tactics. Then the captain asked Vokrath a question that would haunt the admiral for the rest of his life. Did the Vraxians truly believe humanity had never learned to fight? Did they imagine that a species which had clawed its way from stone tools to faster-than-light travel had done so peacefully? The captain explained that humanity had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times through warfare, that they had developed weapons capable of sterilizing entire planets, that their history was written in the blood of billions. Humanity had not forgotten those lessons. They had simply hoped never to use them again. The Vraxians had removed that option. The same scenario played out in 2 other star systems as the remaining Vraxian battle groups met identical fates. Human forces emerged from quantum space with perfect timing and positioning, destroyed or disabled Vraxian ships with terrifying efficiency, and left the survivors floating helplessly while delivering the same educational message. In 6 hours, the Vraxian Empire lost 1,500 warships, nearly a quarter of their total military strength. Not a single human vessel was destroyed. 17 suffered minor damage from lucky shots, but even those remained fully combat capable. The message was clear and unmistakable. Humanity was not defenseless. They were deadly. On the Vraxian homeworld, Emperor Kraxith received the reports with mounting disbelief that slowly transformed into cold fear. His military advisor stood silent, unable to explain how their mighty fleets had been swept aside like dust. The humans had not simply won battles. They had demonstrated absolute technological and tactical superiority. Every Vraxian advantage in size, numbers, and experience had meant nothing. Kraxith pulled up the historical files his intelligence service had compiled on humanity, files he had dismissed as irrelevant propaganda. Now he read them with dawning horror. The humans called their great conflicts world wars, and the casualty figures defied comprehension. 60 million dead in one war, 80 million in another. The humans had fought battles where hundreds of thousands died in single days, and they had continued fighting for years afterward. They had besieged cities until the inhabitants resorted to eating their own dead rather than surrender. They had developed nerve agents that caused such agonizing death that even the humans who created them were horrified. They had split atoms to create weapons that could destroy cities in microseconds, then built thousands of such weapons and aimed them at each other. But what truly terrified Kraxith was not the violence itself, but the systematic nature of it. Humans had studied warfare the way other species studied art or philosophy. They had military academies that ran for centuries, teaching strategy and tactics to generation after generation of officers. They had historians who analyzed every battle, every decision, every mistake to extract lessons. They had developed concepts like total war, where entire civilizations mobilized every resource toward victory. They understood logistics, intelligence gathering, propaganda, asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, siege warfare, naval warfare, aerial warfare, and dozens of other specializations that the Vraxians had never considered separately. The Emperor accessed footage from the recent battles, watching in stunned silence as human ships moved with choreographed precision. Every maneuver had purpose, every shot had meaning. Every tactical decision flowed from doctrine refined over millennia of brutal experience. The Vraxians fought like warriors, brave and strong but ultimately predictable. The humans fought like scientists conducting experiments, testing hypotheses and adjusting variables. They had turned warfare into a discipline, an art form, a science. And they were masters of it in ways the Vraxians could never match. Kraxith's communicator chimed with an incoming message on a priority channel. It was from Earth, the first communication humanity had sent since the destruction of Sanctuary Prime. The Emperor accepted the transmission with trembling claws. Admiral Kaney's face appeared, and the human's expression was not angry or triumphant. It was tired and sad, like a teacher disappointed that a lesson had to be taught the hard way. Kaney spoke in standard galactic, his words chosen carefully and delivered with quiet authority that somehow carried more weight than Kraxith's loudest roar. The Admiral explained that humanity had hoped never to reveal their true capabilities. They had chosen peace deliberately, spending 2 centuries building a reputation as gentle diplomats and helpful neighbors. They had believed the galaxy was better served by humanity acting as mediators and builders rather than warriors. The Vraxians had destroyed that carefully maintained image in 30 minutes of senseless violence. Now the galaxy would know what humanity was truly capable of, and that knowledge would change everything. Caney paused, letting the weight of those words sink in before continuing. Humanity did not want war, the Admiral said. They never had, but they would not allow their people to be slaughtered without response. The Vraxian Empire had two choices. The first was to continue this conflict, in which case humanity would systematically dismantle every Vraxian military asset until the Empire could no longer threaten anyone. Human forces would target ships, bases, weapons, and command structures. They would do so with maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage, but they would be absolutely thorough. The Vraxians would be left defenseless in a galaxy full of species who remembered their aggression. The second choice was peace, but not the conditional surrender the Vraxians might expect. Caney outlined terms that were harsh but not impossible. The Vraxian Empire would withdraw from all conquered territories acquired in the last decade, allowing displaced species to reclaim their homeworlds. They would pay reparations to humanity for the lives lost on Sanctuary Prime, not in currency but in labor and resources to rebuild the colony. Vraxian officers responsible for ordering the attack would face trial in Galactic Union courts. And most significantly, the Empire would accept permanent monitoring stations in their space, allowing the Union to ensure compliance and prevent future aggression. In exchange, humanity offered something unexpected. They would share defensive technology with the Vraxians, helping them build shields and point defense systems to protect against external threats. They would establish trade relationships that could benefit both species. They would even provide educational exchanges, teaching Vraxian youth that strength could be expressed through creation rather than destruction. Humanity was offering the Vraxians a chance to evolve, to become something more than conquerors. The choice had to be made within 48 hours. After that, human forces would resume operations. Emperor Kraxith sat alone in his throne room after the transmission ended, staring at the star charts that showed his empire's territory. He had spent his entire life expanding those borders, believing that conquest was the highest expression of power. Now he understood that true power was the ability to destroy utterly, but choosing restraint. The humans could have annihilated every Vraxian world. Their technology and tactical superiority made that frighteningly possible. Instead, they offered terms that would preserve Vraxian civilization while forcing it to change. It was a kind of mercy, but one that came with clear consequences for refusal. The Emperor made his decision within the hour. He broadcast a message to all Vraxian forces, ordering them to stand down and cease all hostile actions. He sent a formal acceptance of humanity's terms to Earth, including a personal apology for the attack on Sanctuary Prime. It was the first time a Vraxian emperor had ever apologized to another species, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth, but they were necessary. Kraxith had learned the lesson humanity had tried to teach the galaxy through their peaceful example. Sometimes the strongest choice was to not fight at all. The Galactic Union watched in amazement as the crisis resolved itself within a week. The Vraxians, who had seemed unstoppable, had been humbled by a species everyone had dismissed as weak. Ambassador Chen returned to Union Prime, resuming her duties as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The other species looked at humanity differently now, with a mixture of respect and wariness. They understood that humanity's peaceful nature was a choice backed by terrible capability. The humans had proven they could defend themselves and their allies with overwhelming force, but had chosen mercy when victory was certain. In the years that followed, the Vraxian Empire slowly transformed. Young Vraxians studied at human universities, learning engineering, medicine, and diplomacy alongside their traditional warrior training. Trade between humans and Vraxians flourished as both species discovered mutual benefits in cooperation. The monitoring stations humanity had insisted upon became cultural exchange centers, where ideas flowed freely. The Empire did not abandon its martial traditions, but it found new ways to express strength through protection rather than conquest. Admiral Caney retired 5 years after the conflict, satisfied that humanity's secrets were now common knowledge, but that the galaxy was safer for it. He wrote extensively about the decisions made during those terrible days, emphasizing that warfare should always be the last resort of civilized beings. His writings became required reading at military academies across the Union, teaching new generations that true strength included knowing when to fight and when to extend mercy. The Terran Defense Force remained active but returned to the shadows, a deterrent force that everyone knew existed but hoped would never be needed again. On Sanctuary Prime, reconstruction began with Vraxian labor alongside human engineers. The colony was rebuilt not as it had been, but as something new, incorporating both human and Vraxian architectural styles. It became a symbol of transformation, a reminder that even the worst conflicts could lead to growth and understanding. A memorial was erected listing the names of all 2 million victims, with an inscription that read simply, "They died so we could learn. May their sacrifice teach us to choose peace." The galaxy had learned its lesson about humanity. They were not warriors pretending to be peaceful. They were not hiding weakness behind diplomatic smiles. They were a species that had known the absolute worst of warfare, had nearly destroyed themselves through it, and had consciously chosen a better path. That choice did not make them weak. It made them wise. And when forced to defend themselves, they did so with the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of conflict, wielded with precision and tempered with mercy. The Vraxians had discovered this truth the hard way, and the rest of the galaxy took note. Humanity returned to their peaceful pursuits, building and exploring and mediating disputes, but now everyone knew the truth. Behind the gentle diplomats and helpful traders stood warriors who had forgotten nothing, forgiven much, and would protect their own with absolute determination. The galaxy was safer for that knowledge, and humanity could finally be honest about who they were, both the species they had been and the species they had chosen to become.